This is Whisper from History, where forgotten voices rise again. Imagine a village where over 100 English settlers lived with their families, and then one day, they all vanished. No people, no traces. Where did they go? A village mystery that will haunt your thoughts and never be forgotten. In the summer of 1587, across the restless waters of the Atlantic, a group of more than 100 English men, women, and children stepped onto the shores of an island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. They carried with them hopes of a new beginning, of building homes, families, and perhaps even a legacy that would last for centuries. Their leader, John White, envisioned a permanent English settlement in the New World, a foothold that would rival the Spanish colonies further south. But what they would leave behind was not a thriving town, nor a monument to endurance, but one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, the vanished colony of Roanoke. To understand why these colonists came, one must return to the ambitions of Elizabethan England. The 1580s were a time of fierce rivalry with Spain. England, still a small kingdom on the edge of Europe, hungered for wealth and power. The seas were dominated by Spanish fleets returning from the Americas, loaded with gold and silver, and England longed to claim its share of the riches across the ocean. Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, received a royal charter to establish English colonies in the New World. For Raleigh, this was not only an act of exploration, but of prestige and profit. He envisioned settlements that would open trade routes, challenge Spain's dominance, and secure England's place in the great game of empire. Raleigh's first attempts in 1585 ended in failure. The colonists struggled with food shortages, clashes with local Algonquian tribes, and the sheer difficulty of surviving in a new, untamed land. By the time John White was tasked with leading a second effort 2 years later, the dream of an English foothold had become both desperate and determined. This second attempt was different. It wasn't made up solely of soldiers or adventurers, but included families. Mothers and fathers brought their children, signaling an intention not just to explore, but to stay. Among the colonists was White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, who gave birth shortly after their arrival. The baby, named Virginia Dare, became the first English child born in the Americas, a symbol of hope for the settlement's future. For a brief moment, Roanoke seemed to carry the promise of permanence, but the dream soon collided with harsh reality. Supplies ran low. Tensions with native tribes escalated. The colonists knew they could not last without help from England. John White made the painful decision to return across the ocean to gather food, tools, and reinforcements. Leaving behind his family, including his infant granddaughter, White promised he would come back swiftly. Yet history would conspire against him. England was on the brink of war with Spain. In 1588, the Spanish Armada threatened to invade, and every ship and sailor was pressed into defense. White's pleas to return to Roanoke were delayed again and again. 3 long years passed before he was finally able to sail back. When White's ship anchored once more at Roanoke in August of 1590, the island seemed eerily quiet. As he stepped onto the familiar soil, he found no sign of his colony. The houses stood abandoned. There was no smoke rising from hearths, no laughter of children, no voices calling in greeting. The settlement was deserted, swallowed by silence. Every colonist, men, women, and children, had vanished. White searched desperately for clues. On a post at the edge of the village, carved deep into the wood, he found a single word, CROATOAN. On another tree, 3 letters, CROW. These were not random marks. Before he had left, White and the colonists had agreed upon a plan. If they were forced to relocate, they would carve the name of their destination into a visible surface. If they left under duress, they would add a cross to the carving. White saw no cross, only the mysterious word. His heart lifted with a fragile hope. CROATOAN was the name of a nearby island, today known as Hatteras Island, home to the CROATOAN people. Perhaps his family and the others had sought refuge there, but fate would deny him answers. Storms battered the coast and White's crew, fearful of wrecking their ship, refused to press on. With a heavy heart, he was forced to turn back to England without ever setting eyes on his daughter, his granddaughter, or any of the colonists again. The mystery of Roanoke began there, with a grandfather's heartbreak and an empty village on the edge of the New World. For centuries, historians, archaeologists, and storytellers have debated what became of the lost colony. Some believe the settlers attempted to sail back to England on their own and were lost at sea. Others suggest they perished from starvation, disease, or conflict with native tribes. Yet perhaps the most compelling theory is that they assimilated into local indigenous communities. Oral histories from tribes in the region speak of pale-skinned, fair-haired people living among them, people who spoke of a distant homeland across the ocean. Later, reports from European settlers described native villages where some individuals had gray eyes, a trait uncommon in the Americas but familiar to Europeans. Could these be the descendants of Roanoke's colonists, absorbed into the cultures around them, their English identity slowly fading into something new? The fate of Virginia Dare, the infant born to Eleanor and Ananias Dare, remains particularly haunting. To some, she is remembered as a symbol of innocence lost, a child who embodied the hope of a new world, but whose life was consumed by silence. In later folklore, she became a figure of myth, her story woven into legends of survival, transformation, and even curses. For early Americans, Virginia Dare was more than just a child. She was a reminder of the fragility of beginnings, of how easily dreams could be undone. The disappearance of Roanoke echoed back to England as both shame and warning. Raleigh's ambitions suffered, and for years English colonization faltered. Yet the mystery also left behind a powerful allure, a story that outlasted failure. When Jamestown was finally established in 1607, 20 years later, the settlers carried with them the ghost of Roanoke, a warning of what could happen if they faltered, and a question that lingered in the background: what became of those who tried before? Archaeological digs on Roanoke Island and Hatteras have uncovered tantalizing hints but never definitive answers. Broken pottery fragments, English tools, and relics suggest contact and mingling with native tribes, but no single discovery has solved the puzzle. Each artifact is like a whisper from the past, suggesting possibilities but never speaking with certainty. The silence of Roanoke remains unbroken. What makes the mystery endure is not only the unanswered question of survival, but the deeply human story at its heart. These were not just colonists, but families. Ordinary men and women who dared to cross an ocean for the promise of a better life. They built homes, raised children, and carved words into wood, trying to leave behind a message that might carry across time. In their disappearance, we see both tragedy and resilience. Perhaps they died unknown, their bones lost to the soil of Carolina. Or perhaps they lived on, their blood mingling with the people of the land, their stories absorbed into a culture far older than their own. Either way, they became part of America, not through monuments or written records, but through mystery, memory, and imagination. The lost colony of Roanoke is more than a historical puzzle. It is a reflection of the risks of beginnings, of the costs of ambition, and of the fragile line between survival and loss. It asks us to imagine standing in John White's shoes, returning after years of separation, only to find the homes empty and the voices gone. It asks us to consider how history remembers those who vanish without leaving answers. And it reminds us that even in silence, some stories endure, not because they are solved, but because they refuse to be forgotten. For more than 4 centuries, the word CROATOAN has lingered in American memory, carved not only into wood but into the imagination of a nation. It is a mark left by the vanished, a single clue that has invited endless speculation. And perhaps that is the final legacy of Roanoke. Not a thriving colony, not a failure buried in obscurity, but a question without end. A story that still compels us to wonder where the missing voices of that village truly went, and whether their descendants walk among us even now. The mystery of Roanoke still echoes through the winds. And where did the settlers go? Perhaps it is a secret that may never be uncovered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Whisper from History. This video is narrated by an AI voice. Script and editing done by human.